Well, hello again, folks. Today we're moving into the 7th chapter of Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. And this chapter is a great example of one where context really must be taken into account, because without a context we could draw all sorts of misleading statements out of this passage. And one of the first things we must understand here is that Paul is now blatantly turning towards the specific issues that were at hand in Corinth. So the opening line of this chapter is, "Now for the matters you wrote about." So that tells us that Paul is now writing in direct response to circumstances highlighted in a previous letter sent by the Corinthians to him. Now, that's not to say that there is just nothing in this passage that applies generally to us or the church in all ages, in all places. But we must recognize that a lot of what Paul is saying here arises out of very specific circumstances, and so it must be understood within its context before we can draw any kind of general principles out of the text that apply to us today. So we want to have a brief look at this and see what we can find. As we've seen in previous chapters, one of the main issues going on in Corinth is that the leadership and authority of the Apostle Paul himself is being challenged. So many of these Corinthian believers are taking exception to what Paul has been saying or maybe what he's been writing in previous letters, and they are challenging him about his teaching. Now, we've already seen that they have developed this kind of spirituality that tells them that they are morally superior to others around them and are almost even excused from sins of the body because their knowledge and their wisdom is so lofty, supposedly. So the attitude they have when it comes to all of, or a lot of Paul's teachings about, especially about living godly lives, is, well, why can't we just do all those things anyway? And this chapter then can really be split into two. You've got section 1 from verse 1 to 24, and it's mostly focused on marriage. And then section 2 would be from verses 25 to 40, and it's mostly about life as a single person. And really the main argument, actually, of the entire chapter comes in verse 17, this principle. Paul says each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. And one commentator actually breaks down the entire chapter according to that principle. So verses 1 to 7, to the married people, Paul says, stay married with full conjugal rights. Verses 8 and 9, to the unmarried and to widows, Paul says it is good to stay unmarried. Verses 10 to 11, to the married where both partners are believers, Paul says, stay married. Verses 12 to 16, to the married where only one person is a believer, Paul says, stay married. Verses 25 to 38, to those who are pure and unmarried, Paul says, stay as you are. Verses 39 to 40, to widows, remaining unmarried after your husband dies is better, according to Paul. So, the obvious question here then, the question that we need to consider is, well, why? Why is Paul saying this? Why is he saying remain the same? Why is he not wanting anyone to change their situation? And this is where we need to recognize that Paul is writing in response to a letter previously sent from the Corinthians to him. Something was going on in this church. Clearly there was some kind of pressure within the congregation to either dissolve or abstain from marriage itself. And Paul's response to both sides of the argument is stay as you are. If you're married or you're unmarried, just remain that way and it's fine. You're not sinning, you're not breaking the rules or the laws of God. Now, what is clear is those who are married, Paul doesn't really give any hint that they ought to divorce. There's no kind of leeway given. If you're married, you've got to remain married. He says in verse 10 that a wife must not separate from her husband. And he even says, it's not I who gives that command, it is the Lord himself. But to those who are unmarried, he does seem to give a little bit of leeway. So in verses 32 to 35, he gives his opinion that it's better not to be married so that you can focus more on the will of the Lord and on serving him with all of your heart. But he also has said previously in verse 9 that if you really feel you need to marry, then you should just do so. It's not a crime. But without doubt, generally, Paul is encouraging a remain as you are approach to married or unmarried life. And that's because of these issues in Corinth. One commentator says that because these Corinthians believe themselves to be on this higher spiritual plane than others, they perhaps actually viewed marriage itself as earthly. So therefore it belongs entirely to this age that is passing away. And so it was almost in danger of becoming corrupt, something to be looked down upon, something even to be considered inappropriate or wrong. And so here in this chapter, Paul is saying that's actually just not the case. And a lot of this can be summed up with the example that Paul gives in verses 18 to 24. So in a nutshell, Paul is saying here, all these things, our marriage status, our jobs, our physical attributes, whether we've performed in ceremonial rituals or not, none of it actually matters at all before the Lord. He says in verse 19, the only thing that counts is keeping God's commands. So folks, here's the important general principle that we can take. The Lord cares about our hearts, and he cares about the motives, the attitudes that reside therein. If we are married, then Paul really is saying our aim should be to stay married and have as healthy a marriage as we can by honouring God and loving our spouse, whether that's emotionally, physically, mentally, or however. And then to the unmarried, to those who are single, Paul says your aim should be to honour God by loving him first and serving him however you can. Now, if the opportunity presents itself to get married, then that's a gift from the Lord. It is him who brings man and woman together, and so you should enter into that marriage with the intention of serving God and loving your new spouse. If we are widowed, then Paul says our aim should be to honour God by living our lives for God and concerning ourselves with his affairs. Again, though, if an opportunity arises to remarry, then make sure it's someone who knows the Lord, who loves the Lord, so you can have a God-honouring, healthy marriage. Folks, Paul's principle that we can take here is God cares about our hearts and our attitudes. Paul's saying worry less about your situation and more about how to honour God wherever you are. That's us for now, folks. Hopefully that's helpful in some way in navigating through chapter 7. Join us tomorrow then as we head into chapter 8. Until then, God bless.